Right, so Keir Starmer is determined to use British steel, to build British ships, British stuff for British people. Grr. So he says. That's the mantra. But perhaps somebody ought to point out to him that British Steel has ceased to exist as a truly British entity and did so a long time ago. So is he lying, just ignorant, or is he pulling the wool over our eyes once more? Why, choose, frankly. British Steel was one of many public assets not nailed down that the Tory government of Margaret Thatcher flogged off back when she was in power in 1988 in this instance, by which point it had actually doubled production since 1979 when Thatcher came in, was turning a profit, which being a nationalised service as it then was, meant there was cash to be sunk back into delivering a better service, all in the national interest, and would have cost us all far, far less to produce. Brilliant stuff, great news for Great Britain. Therefore, naturally, the Tories felt shareholders should get all that money instead of us and the country, and sold it all behind our backs, all very sneakily. Because what they did with British Steel was very similar to what they did with our water companies, which was to change the British Steel Corporation, as it was, the nationalised industry, into British Steel plc, a private company with all assets, goods and chattels being transferred to this, and then along came the investors to stick their money into it. The trouble with private companies, though, is that they can be bought and sold, broken up, taken over. And come 1999, British Steel plc ceased to exist, as it then merged with a Dutch company which I cannot pronounce, and I'm not going to attempt to. But once the merger went through, it all became the much more easy to pronounce Corus Group. So now our steel industry at this point was half owned by Denmark, in effect. Corus itself, however, then got taken over in its entirety in 2007 by the Indian steel conglomerate Tata Steel, far better known. You would have heard of them in the news, no doubt, who have been in and out of the news a lot in recent years, chiefly for threatening to abandon its British sites unless the government stump up public cash, our money, for them. British Steel is really Indian steel, therefore, whether it is manufactured here or not. There is, it should be noted, another company called British Steel again now, and it has existed since 2016, when Tata sold off a steel plant in Scunthorpe to investment company Greybull Capital, and thus we had a British private steel manufacturing base. Called British Steel, we had British Steel back again, but it was a private company. And then history repeated itself again just 4 years later, as this was then acquired by the Chinese Jingye Group in 2020, so that was the end of that. But of course, that is what Starmer is really driving at. And equally why Tata get away with fleecing all of us. Having our own steel manufacturing capability is a critical infrastructure issue. Not only is it of higher quality than cheaper Chinese steel, as for instance, that steel manufactured in China itself, not in Scunthorpe, incidentally, but without steel we wouldn't be able to build any warships, let alone anything else we use steel for in construction, repair industries, car manufacture, and more and more and more. And actually, when you bring up the prospect of warships, you can appreciate our national defence actually hinges upon it, and such is why when Tata and indeed Jingye can show up on the government's doorstep, they seem to be able to get away with acting pretty much like a bunch of bailiffs when it comes to demanding money in order to carry on. So we have an industry we rely on for our security that we don't own, that was stolen from us effectively by the Tories, that the companies that do own them know we don't own and are reliant on still, and can therefore pretty much hold us to ransom. The issue with Tata Steel itself goes back to 2015 when they decided to sell off assets here in the UK. Not least, they tried to sell off the largest works in the country in South Wales, Port Talbot. Obviously, they sold the site in Scunthorpe around this time successfully, but come 2020, Tata wanted $500 million off the government in the form of a coronavirus rescue package as the pandemic saw steel demand drop, which 8,000 jobs hinged on. Now, private company, why should we, as a state, have to bail out such a company? But because we're utterly reliant on that steel being produced here, of course we paid it. Now they want another $500 million. And each and every time they want money, the threat of closure is used. And it works. This time they want us to pay for them to upgrade their furnaces to the greener electric arc versions in order to reduce carbon emissions. So we can meet our net zero total. They want the state to pay for their new furnaces. But they still also want to shed another 3,000 jobs whilst they're at it at this point. Meanwhile, up in Scunthorpe, also in the name of decarbonisation, the government is set to hand Jingye £300 million as well to do likewise. They are currently waiting on a commitment from them to save jobs. Well, what about Tata then? It is bloody ridiculous. We're throwing so much public money at this, at these private companies. Notice we can find it here, by the way, for this. The money's there for this. But again, the argument has to be, why are we spending so much on something that is not a public asset? This is a sticking plaster solution, as the brill-creamed one would say, until the next time these companies threaten closure unless we cough up more public cash for something else. All of this was stolen from us by Thatcher. We should be demanding it all back. Legislate it back into public ownership. It'll cost a lot less in the long term. Our dependence on steel, having steel manufactured in this country, though, that's not going to go away. And it shows how these companies, get away with what they're doing. And Starmer cheering British steel used for warships, well, that should bother us for several reasons. Firstly, he's telling these companies we'll be increasingly reliant on them, giving them even more leverage, because he won't commit to renationalisation anymore either, so giving them the green light to carry on extorting cash from all of us via the public purse. Secondly, if anyone was in any doubt about Starmer's dedication to Blairism, citing warships as the first thing that comes to his mind for reliance on steel should have klaxons going off in your head, wondering who the idiot is going to invade should he reach power, and add in news today that he's abolished the post of Shadow Minister for Peace and Disarmament, and you should be all the more concerned about this man and his potential warmongering. Why is house building not his main driver? Scunthorpe, for example, is a plant that produces long steel products, RSJs, railway sections, that kind of thing. They supply steel to the construction industry, not the plate steel required in, say, shipbuilding and repair, which is my old industry, my old trade. I know a thing or two about such things. So this British Steel Chinese-owned company doesn't supply steel for warships then. Whoops, Keith, you might have told a fib again about that, or did you not know? What he's on about is importing less steel, in effect. But it is still public money going to foreign-owned companies who just happen to operate in the UK, operate something essential to our infrastructure, when Starmer dishes out new defence contracts. Keith has said, we've got new frigates being built ready for 2027. The percentage of British steel in that is 4%. We would change that. I went to Scunthorpe to the steelworks up there a couple of months ago. The workforce up there are determined to go to green steel. They just need a government that actually backs them in achieving that. They know that their own jobs and those of the next generation are bound up in having a government that actually has the foresight or strategic thinking and is going to put its shoulder to the wheel of making sure that we have a steel industry of the future. Okay. So first, what do you mean by British steel here? Because if you mean British owned, as is the implication, as indeed the name of the Chinese owned company is meant to imply, then the answer is 0%, because there's no such thing. It does not exist. If you mean what percentage of the steel in these frigates is made by said company in Scunthorpe only being 4%, that might well be true, because the vast majority of the steel used will be plate steel, which they don't produce, so is either imported or comes from one of Tata Steel's plants, in which case you're misleading people again. If you want 100% British steel being used, then we need to have British-owned British steel back. We need to be renationalising, so we actually do have a steel industry of our own again, because the fact is, we don't. If anything, the companies that do own our steel infrastructure consistently remind us that we don't, by knocking on the door, dressed up like a bunch of heavies, and essentially saying, pay up, or we're going to sack a lot of people and collapse your steel-making capabilities. It is, in my opinion, a matter of national security that we renationalise this. What do you think? Am I jumping the shark on this, or do you see a danger here too? What do you make of the government cowering and opening the purse strings to these companies time after time in the manner that they do, that is demanded of them? Do you believe Starmer and his devotion to British steel, or will cheap Chinese stuff imported be more within the fiscal rules and more in keeping with Starmer's typical level of honesty? Let me know in the comments below. Have your say and be part of the conversation. Thanks for watching. I hope you found the video useful. Please like, share and subscribe if you did. More content out daily. Meanwhile, here's our video recommendation where, despite the fact Labour can't see the wood for the trees on steel, we can see the failure in gas, particularly gas storage, but not because they're going to renationalise that either, not because they're going to fix it and rectify it, but merely because they found another stick to beat the Tories with and score some points on them. And, well, I'll hopefully see you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.